Come, you masters of war, you that build the big guns, you that build the death planes, you that build all the bombs, you that hide behind the walls.
Well, thank you. It's a real honor to be here at Blue Stockings. I was just saying to one of the collective members, Jeffrey, that I've been traveling around the country for the better part of the last 2 years, and I have never seen a bookstore that has a more vibrant, diverse, and just packed schedule than Blue Stockings. And what a treasure it is to have a place like this in New York City, which certainly right now is the belly of the beast when it comes to the financial crisis, the sort of two-headed beast of Washington and Wall Street. And so it's a real honor to be here. I have to start off by saying that I've had kind of a weird run over the past 9 years or so. I cut my teeth as a reporter during the Clinton administration and basically couldn't get my work published anywhere except the anti-war independent media, places like Democracy Now!, commondreams.org, antiwar.com, Indie Media, etc. And then I worked on a collective journalism project with my friends Jackie Suin and Rick Rowley when we were in Iraq trying to stop the war, and we started a website called IraqJournal.org, and it was really pushed by Indie Media around the world, and we were really proud of the fact that it was one of the only sources of on-the-ground reporting that was seeking to tell the truth about what the people of Iraq were facing and not what the politicians were saying the parameters of the war should be set at. Well, then the Bush administration comes around, and I write a book about this mercenary company, Blackwater, which is a Republican company operating under a Republican administration in what people like to believe was a Republican war, and all of a sudden I became sort of popular with the liberal media and was allowed to report for these outlets that I normally wasn't welcome at when it was the Democrats wreaking havoc across the world. Well, now I'm back to my old unpopular self, and I've been spending a lot of my energy over the past months reporting on the positions of Barack Obama, which run counter to the widely held belief that Obama is a progressive, that he's anti-war, that he's somehow going to change the face of the American empire. I have never been so inundated with hate mail in my life as I've been over the past few weeks. And I actually wear it as a badge of pride. Because if there's one thing that the past 8 years should have shown people in this country, it's that we desperately need an independent media that is not beholden to the interests of either of the corporate parties, which in fact are one party, particularly when it comes to U.S. foreign policy. They're a corporate war party. And so I put on an article that I did about the 20 hawks, neocons, and right-wingers that are people to watch in the Obama administration. I changed my bio for all of the places that ran my work that said Jeremy Scahill pledges to be the same journalist under Barack Obama as he was under George Bush and Bill Clinton. And I got waxed for that one, and the comment sections give the guy a chance, he's not even in power yet. That's the very opposite of what responsible journalists should be doing. When Bush was picking his cabinet, all of the liberal media, and when I say liberal media, I don't mean it in the sense that Fox News says it. I talk about liberals in the sense that Phil Oakes defined it, where he said that a liberal is 10 degrees to the left of center in good times, 10 degrees to the right of center if it affects them personally. And so the liberal media were all about criticizing George Bush and his cabinet selections and saying, oh, this is a throwback to the Reagan era, or he's recycling George H.W. Bush's White House. And so all I've really been doing over the past several weeks is looking at who is Barack Obama tapping to run U.S. foreign policy. And I'm going to get into that in a moment. But first I wanted to share with you some breaking news that some of you may have seen. It's been unfolding over the past 48 hours or so. Apparently the Justice Department is preparing on Monday to issue indictments against 5 Blackwater mercenaries for the gunning down of 17 Iraqi civilians in Baghdad's Nisr Square last September, and I'll talk more about that incident. But one thing that we have to be clear on here, first of all, the United States government does not have effective laws that can clearly be used to prosecute the men who did the killing from Blackwater. And no one is talking about holding Blackwater as a company responsible for the actions of its men in Baghdad. No one is talking about holding Condoleezza Rice, who as the Secretary of State was responsible for Blackwater's operations in Iraq, and no one is talking about holding George Bush, the president, responsible. And so even if we have 5 prosecutions of these Blackwater men, it's unclear that A, the charges are going to stick, but more importantly, the fact that the company is apparently going to walk away unscathed from this and be able to say, once again, that the narrative of a few bad apples is really the problem with all of the crimes that we've seen in Iraq, that this is going to continue to be an unfolding injustice. What we have seen from day one of this illegal, immoral war is that the people lowest on the poll take the blame, if any blame is ever assigned, and oftentimes it's not assigned. The lowest people on the poll are the ones who go down for it. Those who implemented the policies, who set the policies, who oversaw the operations, they walk around as free men and women. And so right now there is talk in Washington and around this country of whether or not Barack Obama is going to hold the Bush administration accountable for its crimes. If I had to call it right now, I would say that rather than a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the Obama administration is going to just have a Reconciliation Commission, where they're just going to allow these guys to walk away, because that's how politics is done in Washington. You don't go after people for past crimes. And so the one area, the one group of people that we can look to for any sign of hope in holding these people accountable, and this is true from Blackwater to Bush and beyond, are the lawyers from the Center for Constitutional Rights, Michael Ratner and his colleagues, who have made it their life's work, not just over these past 8 years, but for decades, to go after those in power when no one else will. This was the group of lawyers who had the audacity to stand up and say, we will defend the prisoners who were abducted and taken to Guantanamo, when even organizations like the ACLU wouldn't stand up and do that. It was the Center for Constitutional Rights that filed the groundbreaking lawsuit against Blackwater on behalf of the Iraqi victims, and they filed that suit last year in federal court in Washington, D.C., charging Blackwater with war crimes and extrajudicial killings and 7 other charges. So I've talked to Michael Ratner and others, and they say that even if the Obama administration is not willing to prosecute these individuals criminally, that the Center for Constitutional Rights is going to file a series of lawsuits against George Bush, Dick Cheney. They've already sued Donald Rumsfeld, and they want to make it so that these guys cannot leave the United States of America without fearing prosecution abroad. And the reason that I bring this up is that in this time when Barack Obama is known to have taken in $750 million in money in campaign contributions, if there's one place that deserves our financial support right now on that macro level, it's the Center for Constitutional Rights, because they are going to be doing the people's work going forward when it comes to holding these thugs and other criminals responsible for their crimes. Now, as to the actual facts of this Blackwater case, I think it's extremely important to remember this. We're talking about the single greatest massacre of Iraqi civilians at the hand of a corporate force in Iraq. And it happened on September 16, 2007. And the first victim of the Blackwater mercenaries that day was a young Iraqi medical student named Ahmed Haytham al-Rubai. Ahmed Haytham al-Rubai was driving his mother in the family's white Opel sedan at about noon on a Sunday, and they were running a series of errands. His mother was a medical doctor. His father also was a doctor. Medicine was very much in this family's DNA. And on that day, among the errands they were running was dropping off college applications for Ahmed's younger sister. And this was a family that could have left Iraq when the invasion was imminent. But because they were all medical professionals, they decided to stay, because they felt that more than ever in the history of their country, as far as their life was concerned, there was never a greater need for medical professionals as that which existed in Iraq when the U.S. was invading and occupying the country, and so they stayed. And on that day, when they were running these errands, they pulled into an intersection in the Mansour district of Baghdad known as Nisr Square. And while they were pulling into that intersection, a convoy of heavily armored vehicles was driving in the wrong direction down a one-way road. Iraqi police officers scrambled to try to block off traffic, not to protect the armored vehicles, but to protect the Iraqis, because Iraqi cars are often shot at simply for coming too close to the most important people in their country, who are in fact not Iraqis, but U.S. diplomats and other dignitaries being guarded by mercenaries. Well, Ahmed Haytham al-Rubai didn't stop fast enough for the men in the armored vehicles, and so one of the men atop that South African Mamba armored car fired a bullet directly through the windshield and hit Ahmed Haytham al-Rubai in his forehead, killing him instantly. His mother began to shriek out, my son, help me, help me." 2 Iraqi police officers responded, ran over, and they described, and I tell this story in my book, they described trying to pull his mother Mahassan out of the car because they were afraid she was going to get shot as well. And her grip on her son's dead body was so tight that they couldn't get her out. And they realized that the guys in the armored car were going to fire more shots, and the police officers ran. And bullets rained down on that car and exploded it, engulfing it in flames. And Mahassan, his mother, died inside of the vehicle as well. That shooting of Ahmed and his mother Mahassan kicked off 15 minutes of sustained gunfire in a very crowded intersection in Baghdad. At the end of it, 17 Iraqis were killed, among them women and children. One of the youngest victims was a 9-year-old boy named Ali, who was shot in his head when he sat in the van of his family's vehicle. And his father describes picking up his son's dying body and putting his hand over his heart, and he could still feel it beating. And so he sprinted from the scene to a local hospital in an effort to save his son's life, but his son was pronounced dead at the hospital. His father returned the next day to gather pieces that he could find of his son's skull so that he could take as much of his body as he could piece together to the Iraqi holy city of Najaf to bury his son. People were shot in the back as they fled. Helicopters were also hovering overhead, and witnesses say they were firing on people as well. And as we know, the people that did the shooting in the square that day that killed these 17 people were not active duty U.S. soldiers. This wasn't the Marines. And it wasn't Muqtada al-Sadr's Mahdi army. They were corporate forces working for a politically connected mercenary company called Blackwater, which when Paul Bremer was the viceroy of Iraq until now, they've operated in a climate where immunity and impunity have gone hand in hand. And what happened after that shooting is that the U.S. State Department and the Bush administration conspired with Blackwater to try to cover up this crime, to say that Blackwater was the victim of an armed ambush by enemies and insurgents, and to preemptively immunize the men who did the shooting from any effective prosecution. The State Department investigators, now this is interesting, the State Department hires Blackwater and then investigates Blackwater in a criminal case. The FBI should have done the investigation. It took the Bush administration 2 weeks to send them over. So you have the fox guarding the hen house in this investigation, and they gave these guys immunity before they even determined who was guilty of what. So now, as federal prosecutors seek to prosecute Blackwater, these 5 guys, they face a situation where many, if not all of them, have already been given immunity from the State Department. Just to put this in a historical context, Oliver North got off on the criminal charges against him after Iran-Contra because he was given limited use immunity in return for his congressional testimony. That is the exact form of immunity that the Blackwater shooters have been given by the State Department. So even if the Justice Department goes ahead with this prosecution, they are going to have to prove that no evidence that they gathered came as a result of the testimony given by these Blackwater guys to the State Department, and none of them have cooperated in the federal investigation. Now, what's interesting about this, and I still can't wrap my head around it, I'm totally against the militarization of the so-called war on drugs. This is not a war on drugs in this country, and outside of this country, it's a counterinsurgency war, particularly in Latin America. We have a radical militarization of the war on drugs, but one of the laws that they're looking at charging these guys under is a war on drugs law passed in the Reagan era that seeks to impose a mandatory 30-year minimum sentence on anyone who uses a machine gun in the commission of a crime. And so one of the potential avenues that they're pursuing is prosecution under this bizarre and seldom used anti-drug law under the Reagan administration. In the context of Barack Obama becoming president, there's a few things that need to be said. Number one, Obama is not against Blackwater. He says he will not sign on to legislation to ban them, and that his senior foreign policy advisor told me that he cannot and will not rule out using them in Iraq. Now, the reason for that is that Obama has an Iraq plan that will not end the occupation. It will downsize it and rebrand it, and he's going to continue using these private forces, which currently operate at a greater than 1-to-1 ratio with U.S. soldiers. 196,000 corporate personnel, 145,000 to 150,000 U.S. soldiers in Iraq. The other part of this, though, is that Barack Obama and his administration are making it very, very clear that they want to, quote, look forward and not look backward. We need to have full accountability for all of the crimes committed by the U.S. military in Iraq and all of the crimes committed by their shadow army of mercenaries and other private forces there. And so this is something that the Obama administration, it's not about pressuring, begging, pleading with, it's confronting. The Obama administration needs to be confronted on this lack of spine to go after these politically connected companies and the officials that sent them there in the first place. Now, I don't know how many of you saw this article that was in the New York Times the other day by Tom Shanker, but he said that he reported on what he called an apparent evolution in Barack Obama's thinking about Iraq. And this evolution is that Obama apparently plans to keep a residual force in Iraq of up to 55,000 US troops after he's done withdrawing. Now, anyone who's been paying attention to Obama's positions and the serious foreign policy speeches that he's given, not the stuff about change we can believe in and I was against the war and I'm going to end it in 2009, but actually reading the plan, talking to the people, listening to the serious speeches, there's no evolution. Obama never was saying that he was going to totally end the war when he was talking to people who he actually wanted to listen to him. When he was talking to the Kool-Aid drinkers at rallies, of course, Obama was all about ending the war. But when he was talking to the military folks, when he was talking to the conservatives, when he was talking to AIPAC, he sang a very different tune, and that's the tune that he intends to play as President of the United States. So yes, Obama probably will make good on his commitment to start withdrawing combat brigades out of Iraq. Now, whether or not he's going to complete this according to his 16-month or 18-month timetable, I think can be called into very serious question. But let's just take him at his word on that. He pulls these this 16-month withdrawal of combat brigades. He then leaves in force 55,000 U.S. soldiers and an equal number of contractors. So that's over 100,000 personnel that Obama is going to keep in Iraq, and he will have defined that as ending the war. So it's not an apparent evolution, it's that we need to understand what Barack Obama means when he uses the words residual, end, war, and decisively, because that is his definition of ending the war. 100,000 U.S. troops and contractors remaining in Iraq for the foreseeable future. So from reading Barack Obama's policy papers, from studying Barack Obama's serious foreign policy speeches, not campaign rhetoric, from looking at all of those closely, combined with who he has hired to run U.S. foreign policy, we get a very clear sense of what's going to happen over the next 4 years. Now, Obama and his campaign defined as the, quote, premier foreign policy issue of our generation, the war in Iraq. He criticized Senator Hillary Clinton on the campaign trail for being on the same side as George Bush and John McCain. And he said they were wrong about the premier foreign policy issue of our generation, and I was right. So one would presume then that Obama would want to hire a team of people for U.S. foreign policy who were, quote, right about the premier foreign policy issue of our generation. He has not hired one single solid anti-war person to serve in a foreign policy capacity in his administration. Not one. Instead, who has he hired? Let's start from the top. Joe Biden. Who is Joe Biden? Joe Biden not only voted for the invasion and occupation of Iraq, but Biden was the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 2002 when the Iraq War was being, quote-unquote, debated in the United States. Now, I followed this very closely because I was traveling around the United States at the time, having just come back from Iraq, with Hans von Spanek, who was the former head of the United Nations program in Iraq, 32-year veteran of the UN, an assistant deputy secretary general to the United Nations. And von Spanek had just come back from Iraq, where he met in the north of Iraq with Ansar al-Islam guerrillas, the so-called al-Qaeda presence in Iraq. And von Spanek was prepared to testify in front of Biden's committee, and we called Biden's committee, we faxed them, we emailed them, we begged and pleaded with them to call him. He would have testified that Ansar al-Islam, the al-Qaeda presence in Iraq, was A, fighting Saddam Hussein, and B, was operating from the U.S.-enforced safe haven in northern Iraq, hardly colluding with Saddam Hussein's regime. If there was a connection, he would have testified, between Iraq and al-Qaeda, it was the United States government, because they were giving them cover to operate in Iraq. Scott Ritter, the former chief UN weapons inspector, was also someone we were working with at the time. Now, I have problems with Scott Ritter because of his role in the destruction of Iraq in the 1990s, but perhaps no U.S. citizen knew more about the lack of an Iraqi weapons of mass destruction program than Scott Ritter. He was available and willing and ready to testify, and Biden refused to call him. Instead, Biden, in his capacity as the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, called forward a series of quote-unquote experts who set the parameters of the debate as this: bomb the hell out of Iraq or bomb the hell out of them and send in ground troops to invade and occupy the country. That was it. So Joe Biden is not just some senator who made a mistaken vote on Iraq because he was misled on intelligence. He was a guy who had access to anyone he wanted with full subpoena power to haul them in front of a committee and ask them the tough questions, and he didn't do it. Biden is a hawkish Democrat. He is the epitome of the right wing of the Democratic Party's control on the Obama campaign. He is the best symbol that indicates what kind of foreign policy Barack Obama is going to implement. Number two, Hillary Clinton is Secretary of State. Not only did she vote for the war and refuses to fully renounce that vote or denounce any kind of support for the Bush administration's war, she's continually voted to fund it, but also she was one of the Democrats who put forward the myth leading up to the invasion that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, and one of the only Democrats to actually talk about an Al-Qaeda connection with Iraq. She has been very hawkish on other foreign policy issues, not the least of which was the bombing of Yugoslavia in the 90s. And in a biography of her, a story is retold where she urged President Clinton to bomb. And she said, I called him on the phone and I said, bomb them. And her point was, if NATO exists for anything, isn't it to defend our way of life? That's her perspective on the world. That's her perspective on foreign policy. Rahm Emanuel is as pro-Israel and anti-Arab as a politician can get. He was the only member of the Illinois delegation to vote in favor of the war. He gets a tremendous amount of corporate money. He ran the Democrats' 2006 congressional campaign, where 26 of the 28 candidates he gave money to and did fundraising for were firmly pro-war. He actively tried to stop the campaigns of anti-war Democrats in 2006, and it's because of Rahm Emanuel that we ended up with all of these pro-war Democrats helping the Democratic Party to take back Congress in 2006. And what do they do with their power once they take back the Congress? They cave in on every single major issue of our time, from FISA to torture to Iraq and beyond. Nancy Pelosi's crowning achievement as Speaker of the House was to get an approval rating lower than that of President Bush. And she had to work very, very hard to obtain that status. So you have Rahm Emanuel as his chief of staff. Susan Rice was someone who promoted, she's the UN ambassador now, going to be under Obama. She promoted the myth that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction leading up to the war, and she's been calling for bombing Sudan over the Darfur issue. She's a major league hawk and someone that falls into the camp that Noam Chomsky described as the new military humanists, these people that want to do humanitarian bombings. And the list can go down from there. General Jim Jones, and I love that his name is Jim Jones, and the Kool-Aid thing and all that. But Jim Jones is the director of the board of Chevron Oil Corporation. Remember when Condoleezza Rice, before she got to the Bush administration, she was the director of the board of Chevron and had an oil tanker named after her. So now we have another oil man firmly embedded in the White House. Jones also is on the board of Boeing. He claims that he was against the Iraq War, but was one of the commanding officers who led the initial invasion. He claimed that he stood up to the neocons, but he never did it when it would have counted, when it actually would have mattered for him to put his neck on the line. He remained silent during all of that. Jones is someone now who is going to be the top national security advisor to President Bush. The best, and perhaps this really caps it all up, is the fact that of all the people Barack Obama could have chosen to be his Secretary of Defense, he chooses the man that George W. Bush chose as his Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates. Now, Gates is someone who has a very shady history going back to the so-called Cold War, where he was accused by other colleagues at the CIA of tainting intelligence. You know, something now that's very familiar in the discourse in this country. He's spoken out against timetables for withdrawal in Iraq, and is someone that represents a continuation of the Bush doctrine when it comes to U.S. foreign policy. Now, Gates is likely to be replaced maybe a year or less into the administration, and the person that's being looked at is Richard Danzig, who was Bill Clinton's Secretary of the Navy. So you have a total resurrection of the Clinton White House. You know, some people could say that they thought Barack Obama won the Democratic nomination, not Hillary Clinton, because of the people that are surrounding him now. And look, if you want to see a contrast everything I just said about Barack Obama's cabinet with the following comments. This is from Joe Lieberman. The team is, quote, virtually perfect. Karl Rove, they're reassuring. Max Boot, who is a neoconservative activist, leader, Project for a New American Century, worked for John McCain. This is my favorite quote. "I'm gobsmacked by these appointments, most of which could just as easily have come from a President McCain. This all but puts an end to the 16-month timetable for withdrawal from Iraq, the unconditional summits with dictators, and other foolishness that once emanated from the Obama campaign. Hillary Clinton and James Steinberg at the State Department should, quote, be powerful voices for neoliberalism, which is not so different in many respects from neoconservatism." James Baker, the former Secretary of State and the man who led the theft of the 2009 election, "I see them as being sort of center-right of the Democratic Party." John McCain, "I applaud many of these appointments." Senator Lamar Alexander, "So far, so good." Henry Kissinger, "Hillary Clinton will be outstanding as Secretary of State." And then and it goes on. And the last one that I'll read is this one, which, I mean, there's also Condoleezza Rice, "The country will be in good hands," and on and on. But this one is great. Michael Goldfarb of the Neoconservative Weekly Standard, he says this: "Surprising continuity on foreign policy between President Bush's second term and the incoming administration, certainly nothing that represents a drastic change in how Washington does business. The expectation is that Obama is set to continue the course set by Bush." Those are some of the leading right-wing figures in this country, the people that were the driving force behind the invasion and occupation of Iraq, this dirty war in Afghanistan right now, and they are singing they are lining up to sing the praises for Barack Obama. Henry Kissinger yesterday writes an op-ed, a massive op-ed, I don't know why they gave that guy so much space, or maybe we do know why they gave him so much space, talking about how this is just a brilliant brain trust that Obama has assembled. The reason I spent this time reading these, the reason I'm bringing these up, is because this is the best illustration that we have right now to understand the true nature of U.S. foreign policy. There's not the Democrats and the Republicans, there is the war party. The reason that Karl Rove calls it reassuring that Obama has built this team is that they know that the interests of the most powerful people and institutions in this society are going to be defended for another 4 years. And they're going to be defended because Barack Obama is a status quo Democrat who believes in the bipartisan nature of this destructive U.S. foreign policy. It all boils down to a very simple recipe: the hidden hand of the so-called free market backed up by the iron fist of U.S. militarism. And that's why, when you look at Obama's foreign policy platform, you see the following. He is taking credit for George Bush's escalation of force in Afghanistan right now. Bush sending 20,000 more troops into Iraq. Obama says he was the first one to call for that, and that McCain and Bush followed him. He intends, as of February 1st, to dramatically escalate the war in Afghanistan, which is going to get worse and worse over these next 4 years. Representative Marcy Kaptur of Ohio is one of the only Democrats that I could find when I went to the Democratic National Convention. You know, most places have a coat check. At this place, they had a spine check, where you just took your spine out and you checked it at the door, and then you went into the Democratic National Convention. People who were in the Out Now caucus, anti-war people, equivocating, making excuses. Yeah, but all of that stuff. But Marcy Kaptur, when I asked her about Obama's and Marcy Kaptur represents Joe the plumber's district in Ohio. You know, his name isn't Joe, he's not a plumber, the whole 9 yards. And he says he's going to run against Marcy Kaptur, longest serving woman in the House of Representatives, and she knows her stuff on foreign policy. And I asked her, what, you know, if Obama was listening to you, what would you tell him on Afghanistan? And she said, I would tell him to pick up the phone and call the Russians and ask them what happened in Afghanistan. She was the only Democrat who was clear that the United States has no business engaging in any kind of military occupation in Afghanistan. Obama has said he will use preemptive unilateral force in Pakistan. That is the very essence of the Bush doctrine. He labeled the Iranian Revolutionary Guard a terrorist organization, which codifies the U.S. policy that Iran is a terrorist country that needs to be dealt with militarily. And it contradicts his other rhetoric about sitting down and talking to, quote, adversaries or enemies of the United States. Obama uses the rhetoric of the war on drugs, particularly for Latin America, where you have U.S. mercenary companies making a killing off of this counterinsurgency campaign. It's not a war on drugs any more than it was a war on communism. This is a war on the right of self-determination of the peoples of Latin America and of the global South more generally. And Obama uses that rhetoric and continues to push forward with this militarization of the U.S. war on drugs, which is a backdoor military occupation of countries around Latin America, as you see progressive movements once again redefining themselves and rising up. And there are governments in Latin America that have problems, And we can spend endless time talking about Hugo Chavez, but here's the fact about Hugo Chavez's government. He is a democratically elected leader who has the popular support of enough people to remain in power in Venezuela, and he has stood up to U.S. corporate interests, and he has put, and it's brilliant, he has put the United States in a position where when these fat cats go and fill up their tank at Citgo gas stations, they are paying for the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela. The United States views Hugo Chavez as a threat to U.S. corporate interests. And the fact that they now are building up mercenary forces in Colombia and Bolivia and Ecuador and around Latin America, I think can be perceived as a direct confrontation of the just struggle of people for liberation and self-determination in Latin America right now. And so we have, in this man, Barack Obama, someone who is going to protect the U.S. empire, continue its expansion, and create a situation where the love fest between the neoliberals and the neoconservatives, this grand party, will carry on for 4 more years. On the case of Blackwater, one interesting tension that should exist but probably won't is that Hillary Clinton, in the heat of the campaign, after I did an article about Barack Obama saying that he won't rule out using Blackwater and won't sign on to legislation to ban Blackwater, Hillary Clinton's staff, who had ignored me and dodged me for 10 straight days, issues a statement saying Hillary Clinton wants to ban Blackwater and she's going to sign on to this legislation. The only sponsor of that legislation in the Senate was good old Bernie Sanders. So now it's Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. So as Secretary of State, she's technically responsible for it. So here we are in New York. She's technically the senator that represents the people of New York. I think it's worth a phone call to Hillary Clinton and say, so on January 20th, is that when you're going to start banning Blackwater? I mean, I think it would be a really good question, or someone should ask her that at one of her press conferences. Now, I've seen a sort of pushback when I've written about this stuff and talked about it from people. And you know what's interesting is that people live in some kind of a fairy tale. If I get one more email from somebody telling me I need to read The Art of War because Barack Obama is implementing it, and that he somehow is engaged in some, like, you know, massive jujitsu move against the right wing. He's actually, like people say, what Obama's actually doing is he's going to hire all these right wingers and then have them implement his agenda. I mean, who's saying that? Obama's not saying that. I've never heard any of his people say that. But you have all these people trolling the internet and writing, hate mail and hostile mail, talking about Barack Obama and the art of war. Now, really, the people that are having the wool pulled over their eyes are the right-wingers and the neocons who are going to be used by Barack Obama. It totally contradicts what his actual platform is. And then my favorite line is people who say, give the man a chance. He isn't even president yet. Wait for a year before you start to go after him. Since when is that responsible journalism? Oh, okay, we'll just let Barack Obama cavort with reassuring Karl Rove and gobsmacked Max Boot and all these other people. And then a year later, then we'll reinsert our spines and start actually criticizing him. We have to be consistent in who we are. And the magazine that I write for, The Nation magazine, had written an op-ed years ago saying they weren't going to back any candidates who would not make a swift withdrawal from Iraq a centerpiece of their campaign. And then they turned around and endorsed Barack Obama. And Naomi Klein and I were 2 of the only people that really fought that position, and we did so publicly. You see, the thing is, and I've talked about this before, but this is what we have to remember. You can't, as Kathy Kelly says, be a vegetarian between meals any more than you could be an anti-war activist between elections. And so what we're seeing now is partisanship. Look at the media, look at the blogs, look at the Daily Kos, look at all the Huffington Post, look at all of the echo chamber, like they like to call themselves. Look at all those places. Look at Keith Olbermann on MSNBC. This is Blue State Fox. That's what we're seeing right now. These journalists are replicating what Fox News does for the right wing, except Fox News is better at representing the vast diversity on the right wing. These guys are just representing the Democratic Party. There's no left-wing representation at all. I love when people say, well, MSNBC is the left and Fox is the right, and then you have CNN in the middle. What is left-wing about MSNBC right now? Like, I could get that argument when Keith Olbermann was going hog wild against George W. Bush. He was doing good work. But now he's covering for Barack Obama on FISA. It's a love fest. It's like if there was Democratic Party-sponsored television, how would it look any different than what we see on those programs on MSNBC right now? And so we have a vast intellectual dishonesty. that has just metastasized across the internet, the blogosphere, where you have people making excuses for power because they happen to like the guy, or because he's a good speaker, or because his election was historic. The reality is that what is important for those of us that want to fight for the future of this country, that we actually look at the policies, at the statements, at the decisions that are being made. His first executive decisions turned out to be hiring all of these Clinton-era hawks and throwing in a few Republicans and neocons. There were 130 members of the U.S. House of Representatives that voted against the war in Iraq. There were 23 U.S. senators. There were former CIA people. There were military people that were right, that stood up, that did it publicly at personal risk to themselves. None of those people are being tapped for any jobs. They're telling us we're going to get some crumbs at the second and third tier in this administration. That's not where the real power in this country is wielded. And so it's incumbent upon all of us to do a few things right now. Number one is that we need to be brave in the face of the attacks, in the face of this equivocating and making excuses, and we need to stand up because this country desperately needs the preservation of a conscience. That's why I started off by talking about the Center for Constitutional Rights. They have sued every president that has been in power since they started as a law firm. We as journalists should be about the business of criticizing every person in power. Our job is twofold: give voice to the voiceless and hold those in power accountable, confront them, ask them the questions that no one else dares to ask. In fact, the era that we're entering in right now, for those people who have a conscience in this country, in some ways may be darker than the 8 years that just passed, because the tide now is for people to act as though some great revolutionary act was committed in early November when Barack Obama was proclaimed the winner of the election. The forces mounted against the global South, the forces mounted against working people and poor people in this country, people of color, people in prisons, dissenters, those forces are going to remain virtually the same. Maybe Barack Obama is going to close Guantanamo. Maybe he's going to put a softer face on the U.S. military machine around the world. But the reality is that there is going to be a continuation of these policies, a continuation of this form of government and what it represents for people around the world. And so we also, though, need to get away from the internet. Now, I'm not saying totally abandon the internet. I think that there's incredible organizing that can be done online. But one of the things that we saw happen over the past 4 years in this country is that the Democratic Party co-opted large portions of the social justice movement in this country and made them part of a partisan campaign whose aim was actually to reestablish the Democratic presence in Washington, at the White House, and in the Congress. They duped a hell of a lot of people into leaving the business of resistance and going into the business of electing another corporate candidate. And so now we have to sort of deconstruct that, step back from it, and say, where do we go from here? This is not something that we're going to change tomorrow. The social justice movement in this country has taken an epic hit over these past 8 years. And I think that the dialogue moving forward has to be one of redefining and looking outside of the borders of the United States for inspiration. I'll end on this by saying that, I went to Seattle in 1999 to cover the World Trade Organization protests and the rebellion there against the WTO. And one thing that has always stuck with me everywhere that I've gone ever since was how what happened there was not that the anti-corporate globalization movement was born. It was that activists in the United States caught up to many countries around the world. And if you were there, you remember how many people came in from countries across the globe, and people were listening to them, taking their leadership, because they'd been in these trenches for a very, very long time. And I think that from the era from '99 to the present, we've stopped listening to our brothers and sisters around the world. We've stopped taking guidance or inspiration from social justice struggles that defy electoral politics, that rise above the hot issue of the day, that have very little to do with the blogosphere and everything to do with making ends meet and trying to win social justice victories. And so we have to be more humble as we go forward in realizing that this is not something that we're going to change overnight, that the business of actually maintaining resistance in an empire such as the one that we live in, our obligation to the rest of the world is great. We have an obligation to stop these wars. We have an obligation to confront these disastrous economic policies. We have an obligation to stand up for those who are forced to live on the other end of the barrel of the gun, that is U.S. foreign policy, because this is where we are living right now. This is the country that we live in. We need to confront it. Our responsibility for this is greater than anyone else on planet Earth, and it's a tremendous responsibility that we have. And so with that, I want to end and thank you for being here, and encourage us all to continue discussing these issues as we move forward building this resistance. Thank you. I listed blue stockings as a reference for my application for the Obama White House. I hope you don't mind. So question 62 about embarrassment. And anyway, so feel free to jump in or ask questions, make a comment, tell me I'm full of shit, whatever. Yes.
When I talk to people about the Democratic Party's capitulation 2006 on, basically the answer is, well, if the Democrats hadn't successfully won power, we wouldn't have had a minimum wage legislation passed, and we would have troops in Iran. And that's all they can say.
I mean, so, first of all, the minimum wage law that was passed is a minimum wage that would have been on par with wages about 30 years ago. So, you know, them holding that up as a victory, I think, is a bit pathetic. On the issue of Iran, there are Democrats that are just as hawkish on Iran as people within the Bush administration. The fact is that the evidence for those kinds of claims, that somehow the Democrats headed off some epic disaster by taking power in 2006, there's no evidence to support that. You can go down the line of almost every single issue and find that the Democrats, and when I say the Democrats, I don't mean necessarily people in the streets, I'm talking about elected officials, that the Democrats either capitulated, or they went along with it, or they compromised so much at the end that any scraps we were going to get were just gone at the end of the day. I mean, to me, one of the most telling examples of that was on the eve of the Democratic National Convention, when the FISA vote happened, when Obama and others went back on their earlier pledges and upheld retroactive immunity for telecom companies that were used to spy on people in this country and across the globe. That their convention then was sponsored by AT&T, one of the biggest spy companies around, on torture. The Democrats started the Extraordinary Rendition Program, the government-sanctioned kidnapping torture program. The Democrats said almost nothing when Guantanamo was first being erected. They were blinded by this rhetoric of let's unite the country and be patriotic. You know, the fact that only one senator voted against the Patriot Act, Russ Feingold, is very, very telling, and that Barbara Lee was the only person to stand up and vote against the war policies after 9/11. The Democratic Party leadership has been in lockstep with the Bush administration on everything that is not just partisan rhetoric or politicking. I don't see the Democrats as having headed off any major crisis. I've seen them supporting and pushing forward these crises. Anytime the Democrats win a quote-unquote victory for the people, it is so small compared to what they actually allow or support to go forward on both a foreign policy and a domestic agenda. The best example of that right now is this economic crisis, where the Democrats and the Republicans both have implemented a plan that is it's not, I mean, Naomi Klein puts it best. It's not that they are privatizing, that they are nationalizing the banks. It's that the banks are privatizing the government. You know, and what we've seen here is that the corporations have won the day completely. While people have their homes foreclosed, while the cost of college education over the last 20 years has gone up 439%. The average wages have gone up 120%, and we're just talking about in dollars attached to inflation and other things. 439%. The cost of education has gone up. The corporations are in total control. You know, I don't know if you saw that movie, The Usual Suspects, but there's this line at the end of it where Kevin Spacey's character says, you know, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. The coup already happened. You know, people say, well, Obama, what if somebody would overthrow Barack Obama? Who would want to overthrow Barack Obama that actually has the power to do it? He's going to defend their interests. We live in a corporatist society right now. And so, you know, yes, we have our handful of Democrats in the Congress that soldier on and are about the business of progress and social justice, but you can pretty much name them on two hands. And the rest of them are either lazy, or they go along with everything, or they're a big part of the problem. Yes, sir?
Yeah, and continuing with that, now if the government is being privatized, okay, why are our taxes continuing to be so high? You know, someone's got to pay the contract.
Did people hear him? Yeah, he said if the government's being privatized, why do our taxes continue to be so high? Because because you're being privatized is part of the answer. You pay your taxes, and then the government outsources 70% of the government business to private companies who then take your money and put it back into the campaign process to make sure that their candidates win. Right now, 70% of the intelligence budget in this country is privatized. 40% of the war budget is privatized. Over half of the Department of Homeland Security budget is privatized. All of these politically connected companies get this. And working people continue to get smacked with higher and higher tax rates in a situation where wages are dropping, unemployment is rising dramatically. I mean, you ask a question from a moral position, saying why is it that our taxes continue to go up if the government's being privatized? They're stealing our money, is what's happening. They're stealing it. The great victory of the Bush administration's war in Iraq was that they put on the fast track a system to loot the U.S. Treasury, and we've seen the greatest transfer of public money to the private sector in the history of our country over the past 8 years. That's the actual scandal on an economic level, and has everything to do with the collapse right now. But you're right. I mean, they take more and more of our money and they give it to their friends.
One other thing. To what extent do you, excuse me, to what extent does do like congressmen, senators and legislators, to what extent are they afraid of voting against larger military budgets?
Well, Barney Frank, I think to his credit the other day, called for a 25% cut in military spending across the board.
But did he mean it?
Well, I think Barney Frank meant it. I mean, I'm not saying that as a defense. I'm pointing that out as one. The example I'm giving you is this. Barney Frank calls for a 25% cut in the military budget, and almost no one talks about it. No Democrat said, "Oh, Barney Frank is right."
And don't you think he knew no one would talk about it?
I can't pretend to know what he knows, but the point that I would make to you is this: the number one recipient of war industry dollars on the campaign was Hillary Clinton, because the war industry thought A, she was going to be the nominee, and B, they wanted to be in good with her. Barack Obama then became the number one recipient of defense industry dollars after Hillary Clinton dropped out. These corporations are one of the greatest sources of campaign funding for Democrats and Republicans alike. They're equal opportunity spenders. In fact, you can go back and look for decades, and it's almost straight up 50% to each party across the board. If the wind is blowing in the Republican direction, they give a little bit more to the Republicans. If it's blowing in the Democratic direction, they give a little bit more to the Democrats. I've had numerous Congress people, when I've interviewed them about Blackwater, say to me, I don't want to be portrayed as anti-contractor. It's almost like contractor became the new Israel for a while. I don't want to be portrayed as anti-contractor because they didn't want to offend the big campaign donors from the war industry. The same is true with prisons and education in this country. When you look at the influence of corporations on the U.S. electoral process, you can understand much of the decision-making that goes on in Washington, where most Congress people will not stand up in any kind of a principled way for a sustained period of time in taking on any industry. They'll do one-off issues, or they'll have their pet issue that they're willing to take a hit on those campaign contributions, but they're never going to go across the board. That's why when Dennis Kucinich, who actually is a very, very good legislator, I mean, that's something that's a public secret in Washington among journalists, but it's not something that necessarily makes its way into the corporate media, because Kucinich is viewed as that guy with a silly haircut who runs for president and is always, representing the anti-war position. But Kucinich is actually a damn effective legislator, and he's good at it. He gets challenged by 5 or 6 other Democrats all the time, and they try to tap into the corporate money that Kucinich has alienated himself from, because he actually almost consistently is right on the issues, and he takes on big business. He did that when he was the mayor, and he's done it as a congressman. You have a handful of congresspeople that's true for. Across the board, though, that's not the case. Some of the most corrupt members of Congress are Democrats, and it has to do with taking massive corporate money, payoffs, private jet trips, etc. Any women want to ask a question? Yeah.
I very much appreciate the comments you've made now and other times around movement building. And I think right now, too little too late, but there's a lot of energy and a lot of analysis, and people are wanting to really mobilize a strong, unified movement around the environmental crisis, the economic crisis, crisis in government, the Obama administration, holding them accountable. And I just want to give you the opportunity to speak as much as you like on strategy, on what you see as necessary and desirable in terms of a local movement, national movement, global movement in this moment.
I think that there are a handful of national anti-war organizations that we could get into a very controversial, divisive conversation. But I'll say something in general about it. That I think all of the organizations that claim to be representing the anti-war position nationally need to take a humble pill, and they need to sit back and do a bit of analysis on what happened over the past 4 years with electoral politics and the anti-war movement. And I think that we need to move toward a much more decentralized movement that is organized on a local level in communities across this country, and that occasionally, or regularly, I should say, comes together with a national presence over very specific issues or a whole slew of issues, descending on DC for a week on a wide platform of issues. I mean, there's no mass mobilization to protest the inauguration. People are too busy going to, peace balls and other things. But the confrontation needs to begin sometime very, very soon. And the love fest needs to end with electoral politics and corporate parties. And I would say that the most solid anti-war people that I've met traveling around the country over this past year are the people who have been the same people for 12 years or longer, in the sense that they always are going to be standing up for those issues regardless of who's in power. Now, New York is a complicated place to talk about this organizing. It's also a very important place. Right now, I think that the efforts of the social justice community in New York should be almost exclusively aimed at the economic warfare against poor people and working people in this country because of our proximity to Wall Street, because of the proximity to so many of these corporations that have completely ripped us off and committed armed robbery against people in this country. In other areas of the country, I think there are other issues. In the South, I think that war corporations should be targeted because that's where a lot of them have their headquarters. In DC, I think, is the place where we should periodically meet up, as well as at the United Nations. But I think that we all need to take a step back and really spend some months, or even the better part of the next year, taking the time to develop a strategy going forward and not just running around like chickens with our heads cut off, because then you either get co-opted or you get burned out. And this is the time where the most important discussion to have is, how do we sustain movements now that it's clear that Bush is gone and we're back to a sort of neoliberal economic war against the world, and this hidden hand of the free market backed up by the iron fist of U.S. militarism. So I think a lot of it has to do, I think we have to have strategy meetings in communities across this country and look toward, A, what are the issues in our backyard, and B, how can we connect with people on a national level. And it might be that it doesn't take the form of a hierarchical national organization. It probably shouldn't, but is more decentralized and based on cells of activists across the country who are collaborating or conspiring with each other.
Conspiracy.
Conspiring means to breathe together. Go ahead.
Yeah, if you talk about some of the organizing, maybe you can give me, give a few of us here a little bit of advice. We're part of a group at the New School called the Radical Student Union. Wednesday is the 60th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we're going to be demonstrating outside of the headquarters of L3 Communication. People who don't know, L3 is it's this like 6th or 7th largest war profiteer. They have a mercenary force a lot like Blackwater. They also do all the interrogators and other things. But we're students at the New School, and the chairman or the treasurer of our board of trustees is the head of L3 Communications. Oddly enough, he was also the managing director of Lehman Brothers Financial Holdings before they went bankrupt. The Lehman Brothers actually started L3. So we're going to be marching from L3 to our board of trustees meeting to demand that he be removed and that the university disclose its investments to us and we divest from war profiteers. So I guess I wanted to announce that for people. also because we have flyers, but I want to know what you
Why don't you
think
tell
about-
people concisely again where and when?
Yeah, the fly, it's L3 headquarters, it's like 37th Street and 3rd Avenue. I wasn't planning on speaking here tonight.
If you have it or something, you can say it later. I mean, I think I was just out in California not too long ago and talking to students that were looking at a similar campaign. I believe it was against L3 as well.
We're friends.
Connection. Okay, in California. I mean, I think that what would be a very effective and important series of actions for students to undertake right now is to take the lessons learned from the anti-sweatshop movement and the South Africa divestment campaigns and really target the nexus of war corporations and academia in this country. That was one of the centerpieces during the Vietnam War. I'm from Wisconsin, and one of the big struggles at the University of Wisconsin was the corporate war industry's role on the University of Wisconsin campus. That has been the case of a lot of the most effective student-oriented campaigns in this country for decades. And so you guys, I think, are really onto something that's going to be a very important organizing tool moving forward, because it's something that can resonate with a lot of students when you simply make it clear this campus, this university or this college is in bed with a war corporation that has benefited off of the death and destruction in Iraq and has been a part of the looting of the U.S. Treasury. That becomes a very specific issue that speaks to so many other issues. And even if you just focus on that one campaign, it will bring on other things. So I would just say that you're on the right track and you should try to sustain it. Try to get resignations. Try to get divestment. Try to get a denunciation of this relationship from other officials on the campus. Professors, getting them on board to sign up, which can be very, very difficult. A lot of them don't want to risk their necks. But I think that's one of the best uses of energy for student activists in this country, is to target the money train that pulls into that campus and keeps it going. Go ahead.
Yeah, before, I've heard you speak before about independent media really positively. I think it's really great. But then also there's a contradiction when you speak about, well, for me anyway, it seems when you speak about blogging and the blogosphere. I just wanted to ask you to maybe to speak to some of us in the room that organize a lot on the internet, that blog and so on, just more specific criticisms about that, so that maybe, yeah, just so that we can have more information.
I mean, my just to clarify what I actually think about this. I think that the internet has been one of the greatest driving forces for democratizing media dissemination of information, and certainly in my lifetime. It comes with all sorts of problems, and not everyone has access to it, and corporations control it, and there's snooping and spying, and there's a whole slew of problems. But on a very basic level, it has given many more people access to becoming the media, and that's a victory, and it's great. And I think that that the community of online journalists or bloggers or other commentators have contributed greatly to understanding what's happening in this country, the kinds of policies, the trail of who people are, documents, spreading information around in a viral manner. The same is true, and perhaps more appropriately so, for organizing tools, where you have these your pages, whether it's on Facebook or through Twitter or other places, where you're able to communicate to a large group of people one thought or one location. During the 2004 Democratic Convention, we had this text mob technology that these guys developed, and it was great, and it was sort of the first time that it had been used in the United States on a mass scale, where just everyone got the same text messages saying where police were beating someone, where there was a spontaneous protest, or people are needed to respond here, or we need medical help, and that sort of was before the massive outbreak of the blogosphere. So clearly, I think that as an organizing tool, as a way of democratizing access to information, as a way of getting more people a platform, I think it's great. The criticism that I would have, though, of that world is that I think a lot of these people need to, a lot of people who are engaged in blogging need to get away from their computers once in a while, because I think that if the only connection you have to the real world is your internet connection, then you're not really that connected to the world. And I think that that's one of the reasons why we've seen a deflation in energy and a reduction in numbers on the streets, is because people were whacked in the head with this MoveOn.orgization of organizing, where the idea that if you give $50 or you sign a petition or you send the email to 10 of your friends, that you somehow are done with your work. And so I think we have to sort of be full spec. Blackwater uses this term that we're a full spectrum operation. That's there. So we should claim that term and say we need to be full spectrum activists, where we have the right balance of online, offline, in the streets, off the streets, meeting, organizing, in the street. You know, that's the problem. You know, the whole Netroots Nation, and I went out and spoke at that convention this year. There's a lot of great people there, and there are people that do exactly what I'm saying, and I think they're wonderful. But there's a hell of a lot of people who've gained a heck of a lot of weight because they've just been sitting there at their computers for the past several years, and it's like let's get them back into the exercise of activism. You know?
And I just really quickly to respond, I think I like your idea of balance. And also, I think people need to balance their use of the computer and their and the internet, and then also their activism around the internet. So, I mean, at the same time, you're blogging to also be fighting for access for others, to have that balance. So, to take on the internet as an activist.
I mean, I also think we should have total Wi-Fi zones in this country. You know, it's interesting how the corporations, like tiny communities, like Champaign-Urbana, places that actually try to do that, the companies fight them tooth and nail to try to prevent them from creating open, public, free Wi-Fi. You know, not just because they're greedy, but also because that poses a threat. If everyone can have access to this, oh God, and we don't have our control over it, and we aren't able to stamp it with our brand and monitor it, and you know, you're right. You also, and it's the same can be said of all independent media. That's why we need to defend, you know, MNN here in New York, Manhattan Neighborhood Network, BCAT in Brooklyn. Community television needs to be defended. We will lose it if we don't defend it. And yes, some of it is sloppy and it's messy, and you have a crazy thing where like a monkey is juggling and slapping five with a gorilla, or so, you know, some crazy stuff is on there, and somebody's worshiping the devil, and somebody's doing some other thing, and you have all of that. But then you also have great locally produced programming, Paper Tiger TV, Deep Dish Television, Democracy Now. You have all that. That also is part of that landscape. And now Indie Media has a show that's on MNN, and you know, if we don't defend it, we're going to lose it. PBS has been largely taken over by corporations, and you've got these drug companies now sponsoring letters of the alphabet on Sesame Street, and so we need to defend existing major league media outlets like television stations and radio stations, while at the same time building serious independent alternatives. I think one of the great success stories of independent media, and certainly in my lifetime, has been indie media itself, the indie media movement, and it's messy and it has problems and all of that stuff, but there's some of the best reporting from around the world that happens through that network of indie media activists and journalists and community organizers and others. And I think the Independent, the newspaper that's produced by the Independent Media Center here in New York, is so great in that it takes you back to something which is old-fashioned and dying in some ways, the newspaper, but then injects it with young energy and new ways of looking at building media and reporting. So it's full. We have to be full spectrum activists. You know, you mentioned the Posse Comitatus Act, and I'm sure everyone is familiar with it, but just for the sake of discussion, you know, the U.S. military is supposed to be banned from operating on U.S. soil in any kind of a law enforcement capacity. The Bush administration, of course, has basically run that into the ground and then explicitly violated it in New Orleans and other places, not just through the official U.S. military, but also by using Blackwater and other mercenary forces inside of the United States. I agree with you on the targeting of media outlets. You know, years ago that used to be one of the major focal points of protest in this city, where people would go, and there were moments when people actually did like get on when they weren't supposed to be there, running behind the stage or something. And I think that you're right. I mean, these media outlets are, and Amy Goodman talks about this all the time. They don't own the airwaves. They own their corporations, but they don't own the airwaves. They're using airwaves that are public, that belong to the people. And if they won't give us access to those airwaves, occasionally the people need to take that access. And I think people have done that, and it's definitely a great idea for another place to focus our attention or our energy. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for your talk. It's been very helpful and informative. I'm not very familiar with the anti-war movement's formal structure, but so I'm curious. With regard to the anti-war movement, I think that part of the reason that it hasn't gained the traction that morally, ethically, and righteously it deserves is that there's no draft. So what we have is a volunteer force, and with these corporate soldiers, they're a very highly paid volunteer force. And so let's say, hypothetically, that the anti-war movement just doesn't gain the traction that it deserves to gain in this country. First of all, I guess relating to that, where does the U.S. Constitution fall in the value system of organized activists in the United States? And secondly, in your travels around the country, have you come across a community, a city, or a state where that value system is, there's a greater sense of positive values? One thing I read about before you answer that question recently is that there are communities in Milwaukee that are printing their own money.
That's where I'm from. Yeah.
And, right. So once you do that,
It wasn't my idea.
once you do that, that money doesn't reach those corporations.
Yeah.
It stays in the community. So it seems to me the most powerful form of activism that one can devise, because now you're not even playing the game anymore. I'm like you. I personally think that the whole system has become so corrupt, so endemically corrupt, and so I think it's impossible to repair. So, given that, are there communities in this country that you've seen or that you've come across that have more a strong sense of positive constitutional values that may be safe havens for those of us who are looking for that?
Well, I'll answer the first part of your question first, and then I'll answer that. Regarding the draft, this is an interesting discussion, and I've had this discussion a lot this year. And I mean, I'll just say right out, I'm totally against a draft, but I understand why. Corrupt old Charlie Rangel up there in Harlem, wants to, fought to try to have a draft implemented, because he sees that his constituents are dying in disproportionate numbers in Iraq to, for instance, the kinds of people that go to Sidwell Friends or the Bush twins or someone else. And the idea that you democratize then the human cost of war, I think for poor communities in this country that are going to end up having people sent to die in that war, either because of economic desperation or because they're drafted, say, well, if we're going to be going over there, you go over there too. But what we saw from Vietnam was that the people that were dying in the war overwhelmingly were not the children of the rich. It was the same people that always die in war. So I agree with you that if we had a draft, I think that we would see a pretty swift end to, we would have seen a pretty swift end to this war a long time ago, because I think that we would have had many, many communities forced to live with the reality of that war in a way that they don't have to right now. But I don't think that the draft is a solution, because I don't ever believe in using people as pawns. As to your question about, is there a community that's a safe haven? I haven't found one community in this country that sort of is like figured it all out and has it, and if it exists, it's probably a very tiny place of people that somehow got a lot of money to do what they were doing. Or you have it on a micro level within communities where people, I mean, like look at the place we're standing in right now. You have examples of blue stockings in other areas of the country that maybe aren't a bookstore, but they're a cafe, or the Iraq Veterans Against the War starting the Little Drummer Cafe near Fort Drum. You have people that are printing their own money and using it to essentially trade and have a barter system in Milwaukee, and I think at least a dozen other communities across this country. You have places like in Burlington, Vermont, where there have been moves to try to prosecute criminally, Bush and Cheney. That person lost that election who had vowed to do that. But the point is that you have reflections of what you're saying in many parts of the country. But I'll tell you one specific example. Coming from Milwaukee, I recently was invited there to give a lecture honoring the late mayor of Milwaukee, Frank Zeidler, who was the last socialist mayor of a major U.S. city. And in preparing to give this lecture honoring him, he just died, and I think he was in his 90s. I researched his life, and what was fascinating is that he was a socialist on a local level in Milwaukee. He had a profile within the Socialist Party, and I'm not in the Socialist Party or anything like that. But Frank Zeidler, well, no, I'm just making clear where I stand. But what I think was phenomenal in reading his story is that because of him, because of the socialists who governed the city of Milwaukee, there are public spaces there, huge public spaces. There was a great public education system that now is being privatized and defunded and handed off to right-wing evangelical loony bins. You had all of these public spaces that were defended by the actual city government. If government actually was doing the business of the people, was actually building public institutions, we could get behind those kinds of people. But we don't have, across the board, any kind of a commitment from any organized political party except the Green Party to any kind of an agenda, and I'm not a member of the Green Party either, but to build that kind of an agenda or envision that kind of world. We're so used to being on the defensive that we can't even, none of us can even seem to begin a discussion about what we would like to see, because we've been constantly on the defensive. What would we like to see in U.S. foreign policy? When people say that, I'd like to see a foreign policy based on justice. What do we do to combat terrorism? How about not being the terrorists? How about not occupying? How about not colonizing? How about not invading? How about not stealing natural resources? But you have that kind of conversation in this country, it's like you're from Mars. But we're not from Mars. We actually are people that believe in justice. And on the issue, war crime, when you raised something before, there was a great story of activist success last year that most parts of the social justice movement in this country systematically ignored, didn't do anything about, wouldn't join up with it. And that was that there's a man who's alive today because of activists, because of his own activism and because of the activism of others, a guy named Kenneth Foster Jr. This, if you aren't familiar with the story, this is an incredible story. This is a guy who was on death row in Texas, who was convicted under something called the law of parties, which is a law that exists in Texas and a couple of other places. I don't know if it's more than one other place. And basically, it's a law that says that you don't actually have to have killed anyone to face the death penalty. You just have to have been aware of a crime that was about to be committed or was going to be committed, and you failed to stop it. And so Kenneth Foster, the prosecutor in his case, the judge in his case, the media that covered it, all of them acknowledged Kenneth Foster didn't kill anybody. They knew who the killer was, and he copped a plea and testified against Kenneth Foster, the actual person who did the killing in this case. So Kenneth Foster Jr. was on death row for a conviction that he should have stopped this murder when he was sitting in a car and someone went and ended up killing someone. They said he should pay the price, the ultimate price of dying, for not having stopped this crime or reported it to the authorities. And he claims he had no idea that this was going to go down. I mean, he was totally railroaded. So he's on death row for the better part of a decade. And he and other prisoners in Texas and around the country started a movement called Drive. And they organized from death row to death row to death row a movement of prisoners who said, we are going to non-violently resist our executions. We will not participate in our own death. And we will engage in nonviolent civil disobedience on death row when any other prisoner is facing execution. And they would refuse to put on the clothes, they would refuse to put in for their last meal, they would refuse to walk when they were being brought to the death chamber. And so Kenneth Foster Jr. Became the center point of a campaign from the Campaign to End the Death Penalty and other activist organizers to try to shed light on this vicious law of parties in Texas, but also to save Kenneth Foster's life. And they worked with prisoners who were activists on death row, and then their people on the outside. And when the death squad came to take Kenneth Foster Jr. last year, he refused to cooperate, and they had to bring a SWAT team to take him from his prison and take him, I think it was about 50 miles away, to another prison. And they beat him, and they shackled him, and they yanked up on his handcuffs, and they cut his wrist, but he refused to participate in his own death. And because of his resistance, the resistance of people in Drive, and the resistance of activists, Kenneth Foster was taken off of death row. And he's alive today because of his own resistance, because of the resistance of death row prisoners, and because of activists who wouldn't let him die. Now, a lot of times those victories aren't won, and people do get executed. But when this happened, almost no one in the broader social justice movement was a part of it. It was a handful of people. It's the same people that do critical resistance. It's the people that do prison organizing in this country. And so the anti-war movement that caused celebs on the sort of white liberal left in this country almost completely ignore struggles that are impacting people in communities of color and poor communities across this country. And that's where we saw one of the greatest victories, social justice victories last year, was in the fact that Kenneth Foster is alive today. Troy Davis, another death row prisoner in Georgia, who I believe is completely innocent, is alive today for a number of reasons, one of which is that his sister is a tenacious activist who will not let them kill her brother. And she raises a ruckus, and she's in the streets, and she's protesting, and she has people that have joined with her. And I've had the honor of speaking on panels with her. She's an amazing person. And so we also have to learn to be inspired by this. What I was saying at the beginning about listening to the Global South, also listening to people who are engaged in these day-to-day struggles in our own country as well. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yes, well, I like what you're saying very much. I respect it very much. And then you said you've spoken of so many different things, and I'm thinking of when you spoke about Seattle.
Yeah.
And Seattle and what you learned from it in terms of Europe and in terms of the rest of the world coming and how we need to learn from them. I think, and you just said it just now, how we can be inspired by the rest of the world and what they're fighting for and work with them, I feel is such an important thing. And I feel, this economic crisis is absolutely real. It's absolutely real. What is happening is monumental, and I feel it's a tremendous, tremendous criticism of profit economics. Capitalism itself is being shaken, and it's a great thing. It's a great thing that capitalism is being shaken at its core, at its roots. At its roots. I hope, and I want to know your opinion on that. But also, I think what you said about robbing the national treasury. They're robbing our money, and I think that is a very important phrase. I just heard it tonight, but you hear it in other ways. But I think it's a very important thing. And there's so many issues. There's so many issues, including food, including social justice, equality, and there's so many issues that are affecting globalism. I think we have to see ourselves more as a part of the world. I think not only do we see ourselves up high as separate and unique, I think in some ways we also see ourselves across the board separate and unique. So I wanted to comment on that. I respect your work very much, but I do want to know what your feelings about. It's being shaken to the core, profit economics, capitalism, and I hope and to really transform into social democracy. Learn from Europe and learn from other rising movements.
I mean, I appreciate a lot of what you said. I see it a little bit differently than you. I think that I don't see capitalism in crisis at all right now. I see the corporations showing themselves to subscribe to the very doctrine that Naomi Klein talks about, the shock doctrine, that we have a situation where there is a severe crisis in this country, and they are the people that have the ideas, and they have the connections, and they have been deeply involved with structuring their own quote-unquote bailouts. They've gotten their golden parachutes, and I think that a lot of people reacted in the same way that you are in the same vein that you're expressing right now, where they were saying capitalism is in crisis and this sort of free market system has been shook up. In a very, well, there's no question that the markets have been shaken, right? But the part of it that we really need to spend our energy examining is how they have taken advantage of this to engage in an unprecedented, radical and swift looting of the U.S. Treasury. That's why I brought up, because I think it's the best way of putting it. What Naomi Klein said, I think, is 100% accurate. It's not that the banks are being nationalized or that any of this is being nationalized. It's that a greater part of our life and our livelihood is being privatized by these institutions. You know, Obama picks as his economic team. I mean, I could give a whole talk then about the Obama economic team as I gave about the foreign policy team, but Larry Summers, who is a blatant misogynistic sexist, who talks about women not being as able as effective learners as men and basically being stupid compared to men, gets appointed as the head of Obama's National Economic Council. Larry Summers was called by by the Time magazine the other day. They compared him to Henry Kissinger, but they meant it in a good way. That they were saying, that he could be the kind of effective behind-the-scenes player as Henry Kissinger was when he was in the, White House. I think that it is infinitely depressing, the appointments that have been made on a domestic level for the most part, and on a foreign policy level. I mean, it is the worst case scenario. I think. I mean, the fact that these guys say that this cabinet could have been appointed by McCain, to me, is a chilling example of how deeply embedded these corporations are in the power structure. Let's give somebody else a chance to talk.
Do you see hope in this economic crisis? That was my question.
Well, what I see as hope is that people come to a gathering like this, and that I know there are organizing meetings. And Dan Scott, I'm sorry I didn't email you back. That there are organizing meetings coming up for people to try to talk on how to move forward. I mean, I think that in crisis, the corporations swoop in and they try to grab as much as they can. we also in a crisis need to move swiftly to organize a response. What happened when the bailout was being announced and people just spontaneously, through sort of word of mouth, went into the streets of Wall Street? To me, that was a great action. I was personally deeply moved by seeing so many people pour into the streets. Of course, yeah, you were there. So great. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for speaking. And what you do is really courageous, and I'm sure a lot of people don't like you for what you do. Now, do you feel safe? Or do you have any death threats, or how do you live really?
How do I live?
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't. Look, I think that all of us, and there are a lot of people in this room that have been beaten at protests, have put their necks on the lines. Okay, whatever. Yeah, I have a book, exactly. You juxtapose that with people getting beaten. I mean, I've also been beaten in tear gas, all that stuff. But here's how I would answer that. That I think that what protects all of us, and sometimes it doesn't work, but what protects all of us is community. Is the fact that we are not alone. Is the fact that we are together. And there are the murder of Brad Will in Oaxaca was a chilling example of what can happen to people who dare to go where they're not supposed to go, who dare to be there to convey the voice of the voiceless back to the empire or the belly of the beast. I think for many of us, when Brad Will was murdered, it was a chilling reminder of all of our mortality, but also an inspiration for all of us to redouble our efforts to build community media and to be there with each other and have the numbers, because these things do happen. I get all manner of hostile email. I've stopped paying attention to a lot of it because what would I do about it anyway? Martin Luther King used to talk about the paralysis of analysis. If you sit there and you get scared from any kook and nut job that writes you an email, what are you really going to do? I look to other people in this struggle that I respect for inspiration and protection, and that's I think what all of us do and try to do.
Well, I would like to get a comment. I'm coming from Mexico, so I'm going to try to speak in Spanish and English. So I think you're getting a really big process in your country. We passed that process a couple 8 years ago, and we put out in a party that we have for 70 years in our country, in the power in Mexico, the PRI. So you are taking out just one guy from 8 years in the power, Bush. So I think you don't have to believe that Obama is coming to give all the answers to your society. You have to believe that, guys. We are still struggling in the streets. We're still struggling in the mountains, in the communities, because Fox didn't bring the answer for our society. We believe in Fox because we decided to take out a party from power. So we went all the society to vote and put out the PRI out of the power and put Fox. And we believe in Fox, but Fox was not the answer for the society in Mexico. He was working for a Coca-Cola company, So what kind of answer could we give us to the society in Mexico? Now we have one of the most rights parties in the power, the PIA. Calderon is doing the same shit than here. You don't have to be that far away in Iraq. We have that groups in our country, We call them paramilitaries. They are working on our society, And I think we passed one of the most representative process, and you can really see Oaxaca. We came all together like a society, like a people, and fight for the same thing together. You have to learn that you are not alone. You are not alone in this country. It's not only your country. You have to believe, you have to understand that the good luck that you have or you had before is because many wars was in our countries. It's not only you far away of the borders. Many wars is behind the borders, So I think you're doing a really good work. And one more thing, you have to understand that he has not all the answers for you guys. You have to, yeah, really. I was like you a couple of weeks before, like, you know, try to answer the many questions. But he has not the answers. You have to looking for the answers on the streets. You know, you have to do the process of the change. He has not the change. He has not the answer for all the questions. Obama has not the answer for all your demands. You have to do it on the streets, guys, together. You know, like an organization, like an assembly. You have to do that in Oaxaca. How many people was together? It's not only Oaxaca, it's many processes in the world. You know? But you have to do the change. No Obama, no him, no books. It's really good to be here, sit and listen and go back to home and turn off or drink a coffee, you know? That's not really easy to do. But we need to be together, you know? And it doesn't matter if you are American or Mexican or Bolivian or whatever. It's the same rights for everybody, you know? So you have to do that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Considering that America's poster boy for change is really a lot of the same, is there any hope for actual real change?
Were you here tonight for the talk? Did you just come here? No.
I came about 15 minutes late.
Oh, okay. No, I'm only asking that just because I wanted to see if maybe you hadn't heard some of the earlier discussion. Yeah, I think there's a lot of reason for hope, but I don't see it emanating from Washington. You know, I think that what's that?
Or Albany.
Yeah, or Albany. Right, yeah. No, I mean, I think that the only comment I really have on that is that I think that we as people who believe in social justice and believe in confronting these wars at home and abroad, I think have to redouble our efforts and get engaged in very serious strategizing on where to go from here. And I think that hope is going to be found in those people who emerge out of the rubble of these past 8 years to have a vision that can sustain itself regardless of who's in power or which party is in power. But I think that it's going to take some time to get to that. I think we're going to continue to be in a very, very dark period for a very long time. And I'm sure I'm just stating the obvious that everyone else knows, but I think we can't lose hope. You know, we can't engage in defeatism or just simply saying, you know, I'm up here and I'm speaking in a very critical way about someone that, you know, 70% of the American people right now say that they approve of. But I'm doing it in a spirit of honesty and trying to help push forward this dialogue on how to build actual movements for change and not movements for the Democratic Party. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you said, that capitalism is not in trouble. It's actually probably stronger than ever. But U.S. hegemony is in trouble. And this is actually a part of what, you know, historically, when there's been a change in hegemony, it has always come together with financial crisis and an increased role of militarism and particularly mercenaries. And this seems to be pretty much the situation right now. And I completely agree as well that the only possible answer to this comes from below, from grassroots organizing. My main concern is that there seems to be, I see a danger now that in the same way as that you know, like too much the history of issue-based organizing is going to continue shaping the form that organizing takes. In the sense that now that there is this economic crisis, there might be a lot of organizing going into the economic crisis without looking at the connection that this has, for example, with the war and the military efforts, and the connection with the environmental crisis. You know, like that there will still be like a very fragmented response. Do you have any idea of how, in terms of strategizing, in terms of trying to build something that really can make a change in the speed and the impact that is necessary? How to make that step of integrating all these different aspects, even if it's like, which I totally agree, so it's important that it's all based on local, small organizing efforts in converging, but converging upon a broad platform that takes into account all these analyses, and not just an issue-based one.
I mean, it's very difficult to have that kind of a conversation in the United States because it's so foreign to the thinking of so many people. Collectivity is not sort of in our DNA in this country, and I think that's a big part of the problem is the way that we're socialized, educated, the way that the schools are structured in this society, the way that our economy is structured, where the corporations have more rights than people. And so to start a conversation of the depth that you're talking about, I think really it's part of what I was saying before, that I think that we have to take a humility pill, all of us in this country, and in a lot of other countries around the world, when we try to envision what kind of struggle we can build or continue to build. And I agree, and I like the way that you put it about it being ground up. But part of that means, I mean, when I was talking about the movement to defend death row prisoners in this country, the reason I was raising that is because I think that there is there's apartheid within the social justice movement in this country, and it's been there for a long, long time. And I think that we need to dismantle that, and it means, and for a lot of people, it's going to mean listening to people a lot more than you're blabbing your own mouth off. But on your point about U.S. hegemony being in trouble, I think it's interesting. I don't know that I agree with you. I don't know that I disagree with you. What I would say to that is that we are definitely going to see an increased resistance to U.S. imperialism around the world moving forward. In the 1960s, or the 50s and 60s, the defeat of colonialism in nations around Africa, in nations around Latin America. Now there weren't all victories, but you had the defeat of colonialist regimes in many countries around the world over a sustained period of time. And the forces that rose up out of that, the non-aligned countries, the progressive leaders with revolutionary politics, are not the leaders who are going to emerge as the predominant resistance fighters in many regions of the world. In Iraq, I remember Arundhati Roy a few years ago saying that the people who she is on the side of in Iraq would chop her head off if she went there. That what we have to understand, and I think she's actually making a sort of profound point, you can't choose the method of resistance or the leaders of that resistance for a war that you had a responsibility to stop. And the United States has unleashed Pandora's box in Iraq, and is doing it in Afghanistan, and is inflaming the world. And I think that U.S. hegemony will be in trouble because I think we're going to live in a world where violent attacks against U.S. corporations and military interests around the world are going to increase, and I think we're going to see it in this country as well. So in that sense, I think that you're going to see a confrontation of U.S. hegemony, but those who are confronting it in the fiercest way very well may be people or movements that we have very little in common with. And I think that's going to be one of the great challenges of anti-imperialist movements moving forward, or social justice movements moving forward, is that I do think we're going to see that hegemony in crisis. But I think it's going to be very ugly. And I think that's really all I can say about that. I don't see U.S. hegemony in trouble because of the economic crisis. I think that these corporations have economies that defy nation-state borders, that their economies are larger than many national economies around the world, and I think that they're going to increase and consolidate their power, and they're going to start having their own armed forces and their own intelligence companies. The world is changing radically. The whole existence of nation-state structures is being called into serious question. So U.S. government hegemony, maybe. U.S. corporate hegemony, no way. But it's interesting. Those are very interesting points you're raising. And thank you for doing it. Yeah, go ahead.
My question relates to how you described Susan Rice, and you quoted Chomsky. Are you against military intervention in the cases of genocide?
What genocide are you talking about?
Well, when we talk about Darfur, Bosnia-Herzegovina, what's happening right now in Zimbabwe, because the UN implied that they would use all methods, which might mean military. Are you against the U.S. being engaged in military intervention?
I don't know when the United States has ever intervened to stop genocide. The United States in Yugoslavia, I speak the language, spent a lot of time there. The United States systematically dismantled Yugoslavia because Yugoslavia had an economic model that was neither beholden to the Soviet Union nor the United States, and it was a direct threat to U.S. corporate interests in that region. And the United States worked consistently with Milosevic in Serbia, Tudjman in Croatia, Izetbegovic in Bosnia. The United States was simultaneously condemning genocide and supporting it, supporting the war, the civil war in Yugoslavia. In Kosovo, the worst killing of Albanians that took place happened when the United States began its bombing and gave air cover for Serbian paramilitary forces to go into Kosovo and start killing people. The reason that I bring these up is because the United States, when it was condemning the genocide in Yugoslavia in the 1990s, was ignoring what was happening in Rwanda and was supporting genocide of the Turkish government against the Kurds, of the Israelis against the Palestinians. So the United States, I am against the United States militarily attacking any country, because the United States does not attack countries to defend people. The United States goes in when its interests are at stake. And I think that those people who are calling for military action against Sudan are playing into the hands of the U.S. oil interests there. China controls 40% of Sudan's oil markets. If the United States wanted to stop killing in Darfur, George Bush could pick up the phone and call the Chinese premier and tell him, we are going to stop exporting scrap metal to China tomorrow if you don't speak to the Sudanese government and tell them to withdraw all their forces. This idea that a military response to the situation in Darfur is sort of the only route, and those people that are calling for Blackwater to be sent into Darfur, I think many of them have good intentions. They see something and it horrifies them and they want to do something about it. But those who would actually implement the military action and benefit from it would primarily be corporations and the U.S. military-industrial complex, not the people of Sudan. The last thing I think that the people of Sudan need is more military, more guns, more private forces on the ground. So it's not that I used to describe myself as a pacifist. I don't consider myself a pacifist anymore, but I don't believe in state violence being unleashed against people, especially when it's being branded as a humanitarian intervention. There's no such thing as a humanitarian intervention with the U.S. military or the U.S. government. It just doesn't happen. Let me take a few more in the room. Yeah.
From what I understood, there's a lot of organizations here, people, activists. Thinking about different operations gladi all over the world that happen and still are happening, and all the propaganda that Nixon did against the... How do you think these organizations can prevent, that kind of actions from the government?
I mean, one thing that I think has happened as a result of the economic situation, it's also kind of crowd control or a pacification weapon, because when people are forced to struggle to make ends meet, or to keep their head above the water, or to feed their family, or to be on a endless job hunt in a horrible economy, it's hard to find the energy to be about anything except survival. And so that's another part of our reality right now, is that many people, and it's going to get worse, many people are losing their jobs, or continue to lose their jobs. Students are not going to be able to sustain loans, and I think we're going to see a dropout rate. Women are going to be abused by men coming back from the war who aren't getting adequate mental health benefits. We're going to see a rise in domestic violence. We're going to see a rise in alcoholism and drug abuse and homelessness. And that's all part of the picture that has to be painted in order to answer your question. So the question is, how do we try to prevent these kinds of wars from happening? Our brother over there put it right. I don't have answers. I'm throwing out ideas to questions. The main thing I want to emphasize, though, is that I think that is precisely one of the questions that we need to talk about moving forward. And if I was standing up here before you and saying I know the answer to that question you just asked me, then I'm a snake oil salesman. I'm going to be part of these discussions moving forward, and I hope you are too, because we have a huge, huge, epic battle on our hands that's been going on from the beginning of history in many places across the globe, And once again, we need to catch up to them in this country. You know, the resistors in this country were native people, and now they're in the severe minority, and they're living in utter squalor now. We need to take that humility pill and start to be about the work of answering those kinds of questions. Has books and wants to support Blue Stockings and buy the books, I'd be happy to sign them, and if not, thank you.
Let me ask you one question. Is your money that good? Or will it buy you forgiveness? Do you think that it could?